Young Earth Creationism is precluded entirely by dozens upon dozens of well-known facts of the natural world, from the Radioactive Decay Law, the speed of light, and the nature of the geologic column, to the statistics that surround common ancestry, the fossil record, and our genetic relationship to the rest of the primates, mammals, and really just the entire tree of life. But so frequently I encounter what I am calling bite-sized busts, aspects of STEM fields that entirely preclude young Earth creationism that aren't typically talked about, but bust hard nevertheless. Be it geology, anthropology, astronomy, or physics, here we discuss the minutia of fields that leave young Earth creationism out in the cold. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe if you like this kind of content, leave a like and maybe a comment, and if you feel like supporting the channel in other ways, you can check out my Patreon, my PayPal, or stores. Today we're discussing a creationist classic, carbon dating. We'll cover it generally, and then we'll cover it in some more specific contexts, such as the recent creationist usage of radiocarbon dating for finding carbon in things that are too old, like diamonds and dinosaur bones. We're also going to be covering the very interesting love-hate relationship that young Earth creationists have with radiocarbon dating due to the implications that it has on dating artifacts of biblical antiquity. Carbon-14 dating, known formally as radiocarbon dating and sometimes just carbon dating, is the process of acquiring absolute dates for organic matter by examining the ratio of carbon isotopes. Cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere are constantly converting the isotope nitrogen-14 into carbon-14, and living organisms are constantly incorporating this carbon-14 into their bodies along with other carbon isotopes. All organisms have carbon-14 in their body that maintains an equilibrium with the proportion of atmospheric carbon-14 while the organism is alive. Upon death, carbon-14 begins to decay at a constant rate into carbon-12, with a half-life of 5,730 years. This means every 5,730 years, the carbon-14 in a system decreases by half, converting to carbon-12. Of course, one of the obvious limits is that eventually the carbon will run out, particularly with a half-life that fast. As such, remains older than about 50,000 years cannot be carbon dated. Now, creationists love carbon dating when it comes to using it to bolster worldview-affirming archaeological finds, but then they'll spurn it for pretty much everything else. Radiocarbon dating is fine to them when it's doing things like dating the accuracy of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but other than showing the Bible to be consistent, it's horrible and an inconsistent method, and that goes for dating anything as long as it's older than 6,000 years. Okay, so what's the problem then, right? Why, in their opinion, can't radiocarbon dating be used to date things that are older than 6,000 years? A very specific date, in my opinion. Well, just like they do with pretty much every other method of radiometric dating, creationists will puff out their chests and then beat them and say that radiocarbon dating and radiometric dating, none of these dating methods can be accurate because there are discordant dates and carbon has been found where it should not be, for example, in coal, dinosaur fossils, and diamonds. They will then assert that dates can only be reliable if a certain set of criteria has been met. For example, we need to know radioactive decay rates haven't changed, that the production rate of carbon-14 has always been the same, that the atmosphere has had the same carbon-14 concentration, and that the biosphere has had the same overall carbon-14 concentration. To creationists, you can't just assume these things. They feel quite validated by the discordant dates and the misplaced carbon. Of course, they will again happily use the same method to validate their own worldview when it suits them, but we'll cover that later. Let's begin with those assumptions. Are archaeologists and paleontologists really just big idiots who don't take any of these things into account? No. Young Earth creationist concerns are unwarranted and misplaced. First up, how do we know that decay rates are constant? While radiocarbon dating concerns itself with organic elements like carbon, conceptually and in application it falls under the same umbrella as radiometric dating in general, or the absolute dating of rocks using inorganic elements like uranium. And that means that, like the other methods of radiometric dating, radiocarbon dating is rooted in a law of physics known as the Radioactive Decay Law. This law states that nuclear decay is constant and does not vary in meaningful ways in nature, so Snelling can rest assured that the radiocarbon decay rate may be safely assumed thanks to a hereto unviolated law in physics. The other three assumptions that creationists like Snelling propose can all be explored using alternative methods like dendrochronology. Let's explore how. As previously mentioned, radiocarbon dating depends on knowing the ratio of C14 to C12 in the atmosphere. Because our planet is so dynamic, radiocarbon dating must be calibrated using that ratio, or else the dates can be off by hundreds of years. Although carbon production is easily understood thanks to the carbon-silicate cycle, the carbon in both the atmosphere and the biosphere is a bit less obvious, making assuming a constant ratio nearly impossible. Thankfully, trees hold the key to the radiocarbon calibration. This is because trees add new rings each and every year, and cease the upkeep of their innermost rings. The innermost rings thus begin the conversion to C12 while the tree is still alive and kicking, allowing rings to be cross-corroborated during the life of the tree and indeed long after death. Each ring thus preserves a record of the atmospheric C14 to C12 ratio the year it was added, creating a calibration check for that year for radiocarbon dating. Working with still living trees and our known current ratios, we have been able to work backwards, creating a sequence spanning over 13,900 years, just using dendrochronology. In fact, radiocarbon dates for organic Egyptian artifacts were several decades off the known chronology attained from record keeping before this calibration, upon which they matched precisely. Once again, Snelling can breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that carbon production, as well as its presence in the atmosphere and in the biosphere, can be easily understood, thanks to the very literal record-keeping done by trees. Better yet, equipped with the results of carbon dating the tree rings, it became possible to construct calibration curves designed to correct the errors caused by variation over time in the C14 to C12 ratio. As time has gone on, we have gathered an immense base of literature with regard to radiocarbon dating. We know now how to account for the reservoir effects, such as the marine effect and the hemisphere effect. We understand the repercussions nuclear testing and fossil fuel use create for future archaeologists carbon dating our own organic material of our own time, and we have learned what factors impact carbon ratios in existing organic materials. In fact, it should come as no surprise that every single discordant date that I have ever seen proposed by Young Earth Creationists has errors that are obvious to even a layman like myself, but even more so to the professionals who have absolutely lambasted them for such gross methodological mistakes. And this is a perfect segue to move into our incorrect dates proposed by Young Earth Creationists. It may be interesting to note that most of these mistakes by creationists are evident from the sampling alone, meaning that the dating procedure is doomed far before calibration can ever occur. So how and why do we get these discordant dates? Well, as we'll see momentarily, it's usually due to things like creationists goofing up the sampling or messing up the calibration, or most commonly, contamination. This contamination usually occurs due to well-understood contaminants such as background radiation from the sun or contaminated groundwater and other terrestrial sources of contamination. But these sources are well understood. They have been for decades, and when they show up in a dataset, they stick out like a sore thumb. The most common source of contamination, background radiation from the sun, is well understood. In fact, cosmic rays form beta radiation all the time. This is the radiation that turns nitrogen-14 into carbon-14 in the first place. It used to be that this radiation could not be totally eliminated from the laboratory, so one could probably have gotten a radiocarbon date of 50,000 years from a pure carbon-free piece of tin. For this reason, radiocarbon dating didn't work well on objects much older than 20,000 years years at the time, because such objects have so little C14 left that their beta radiation is swamped out by the background radiation of cosmic rays and potassium-40 decay. However, the modern advent of AMS, or accelerator mass spectrometry, allows us to accurately carbon date material as old as 60,000 years. This is thanks to the number of techniques that have been developed to correct for these confounding factors, which are, contrary to creationist literature, well understood. Let's chat about some of the classics that young Earth creationists bring up in order to discredit this particular dating method. And while we do so, we're going to be covering some of the big mistakes that they tend to make over and over and over again. Number 1 is Walt Brown, yes, that one, and Kent Hovind's mammoths. Walt Brown claimed, and Kent Hovind parroted, that widely different radiocarbon dates have been obtained from the same frozen mammoths, thus discrediting the dating material as both parts that have been dated should be the same date. For instance, they reference the Volosevich mammoth, Dima, they reference the Fairbanks Creek mammoth, and if you know anything about radiocarbon dating flub-ups, you probably do know this one. Embarrassingly enough for both Brown and Hovind, these dates come from different mammoths. The reference that's cited by Brown and then cribbed by Hovind likely refers only to a single Fairbanks mammoth, which Brown tends to mention in other sources as well. That 15,380 date as well as the 21,300 date actually come from two different mammoths. It is also noted that the 21,300 date is invalid because it comes from a hide soaked in glycerin. It is unknown where Brown gets the 29,500 date as well as the 44,000 date. He doesn't actually say. But it should be noted that in 1993, the Dima mammoth was actually reviewed, and all three dates obtained for it were found to be around 40,000 years ago. Dates for deposits surrounding the mammoth were also consistent with dates for the mammoth, so we aren't actually sure where those discordant dates cited by Brown and cribbed by Hovind come from. Number 2, the wood and the basalt. Andrew Snelling's 45,000-year-old wood found in 45-million-year-old basalt is another old-school creationist classic. Now, Andrew Snelling is in fact a geologist, this much we know, but as we've seen before, and as we'll see again momentarily, there's still a lot of mistakes going on, and Snelling, oddly enough, makes mistakes that are... they don't make sense for a geologist of his caliber, of his education, to make. So I will leave you to mull over those implications. In 1993, several samples of charred and petrified wood were collected during construction of a mining ventilation shaft in central Queensland. The wood samples were seemingly well preserved inside the lava flow that encased them. Since the layers of basalt overlaid the early Cenozoic sediments, the expected age of the lava flow itself might be a few tens of millions of years. Not convinced by conventional ages of this geologic column, however, local Young Earth geologists paid to have the basalt dated by the potassium-argon method and the wood fragments dated by the radiocarbon method. Their reasoning was simple and seemingly innocent. If indeed the Earth is old, then fossilized wood from an ancient lava flow should contain no radioactive carbon. If the Earth, though, is young, as they claim, however, then detectable C14 should be present in the fossilized wood, and the KAR age of basalt cannot then be taken seriously. Snelling loves this example, and has gabbed about it on Answers in Genesis as well as in presentations. Now, you might be wondering, why exactly does this bode well for Snelling and other creationists if none of these, quote, wrong dates, unquote, fall within 6,000 years? Well, Snelling offers as an example an absolutely bonkers assertion without any empirical support. He says that since magnetic fields were stronger in the past, carbon levels must have been higher. He's cool with pushing this to 100 to 200 times higher, and basically, as always, pins it on the global flood. Of course, this assumes that magnetic fields haven't been fluctuating and rather have been consistently reducing, which is absurd for a number of reasons. And it additionally assumes that conventional science does not hold that carbon in the atmosphere varies with time, which they do. So with Snelling's baseless idea out of the way and young Earth creationists still empirically helpless to cope with 50,000-year-old dates, how about that wood? Dr. Snelling submitted 2 samples of wood to 2 independent laboratories for radiocarbon dating by accelerator mass spectrometry. He argues that since the lab obtained finite ages from organic-derived carbon, the fossilized wood cannot possibly be tens of millions of years old. He reports the results as follows. There are a handful of issues right off the bat. First, all of these ages are close to the practical limit of radiocarbon dating. Even today, radiocarbon ages exceeding 40,000 to 50,000 years are commonly considered suspect because so little radioactive carbon is being measured that it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish it from contamination or background interference. Second, neither set of dates overlaps within uncertainty, as the sample age differs substantially from one lab to the other. Ages for the other wood samples differ by more than 8,000 years, meaning that Geochron measured more than twice the concentration of C14 in the same sample compared to ANSTO's analysis. This points like an arrow to different preparation methods and atmospheric contamination, which we will talk more about in a bit. But more importantly, this seriously damages Snelling's idea that this wood was buried in the global flood. If that was the case, this wood should date at the very least within the same range, but in reality, they shouldn't differ even at all. Third, 2 of the analyses, the first and last samples, yielded large inconsistencies and uncertainties, which can result when too little C14 is present or when the source of C14 is not consistent. This again points to contamination. Dr. Snelling provides several additional clues that would lead any other geologist or investigator to find better samples for dating. For instance, the basalt flow encasing the wood was only 21 to 25 meters below the surface, meaning that it was long exposed to surface waters percolating downwards into the rock. These surface waters contain not only modern atmosphere, but also organic acids that bond tightly to wood. The wood fragments themselves show evidence of being altered by intruding waters, as Dr. Snelling himself notes, quote, "Permineralization was too advanced," unquote, to identify taxonomically important features under the electron microscope. The porous and jointed, or fractured, basalt was also altered. In the case of the wood, all signs point to contamination. In fact, Snelling himself admits that it cannot be ruled out. Now, I've included a link from geologist Jonathan Baker. He's been on the channel before. It's in the description, and he has done some excellent math that further points to contamination. So how about those living snails, the ones that are frequently used by the Hovens and were dated to 2300 and 27,000 years respectively? Well, evidently creationists are unaware of the reservoir effect. Shocking, I know. The springs from which the snails came were fed by carbonate aquifers. As this water percolated through the enclosing carbonates, it dissolved limestone and dolomite hundreds of millions of years old. The dissolution of this limestone and dolomite introduced considerable quantities of dead carbon into the groundwater. As a result, the groundwater which fed the spring and in which the snails lived was significantly deficient in carbon-14 relative to what is found in the atmosphere. When the snails made their shells, they incorporated an excess amount of dead carbon relative to the modern atmosphere into their shells, which resulted in the excessively old apparent date. Now, contrary to the complaints of creationists, conventional scientists are well aware of this effect and they test for it and take it into account when interpreting radiocarbon data. In cases where corrections for the presence of dead carbon cannot be made, such dates are readily recognized as erroneous and can be safely discarded. This is not the fatal flaw to radiometric dating that some creationists claim and so desperately want it to be. It just shows that dates from mollusks from streams and lakes need to be carefully evaluated as to their reliability. Other materials such as wood, charcoal, bone, and hide would remain unaffected by the reservoir effect. If found with the shells in the same layer, they can actually be used to determine whether the shells are locally affected by the reservoir effect, and if so, how much of their radiocarbon dates have been skewed by it. Reservoir effects have been known about since like the 80s, so I think that the creationists should know better by now, especially those professionals. Another classic example has got to be the radiocarbon being found in coal. Now, coal and oil, according to conventional science, are millions of years old, having been formed during the Carboniferous period. Young Earth creationists, though, point to these alleged instances of radiocarbon found in coal and in oil. They argue that, effectively, all the carbon-14 in a sample would have decayed by that time, so since carbon-14 still exists in coal, it must be a maximum of 50,000 years old. This was originally proposed by Baumgartner, but has seen usage by the likes of Snelling as well. Snelling has extrapolated on this, noting that erroneous coal ages are within 2,000 years of one another, which he proposes heavily bolsters his claim. The main glaring issue should feel reminiscent of early parts of the video, which is that dates close to the limit of radiocarbon dating commonly indicate contamination. Remember, C14 from the atmosphere can contaminate a sample, but new C14 from the background radiation due to radioactivity in surrounding rocks has also been documented as being capable of contaminating a sample. A few additional processes that can add C14 to coal are sulfur bacteria, which commonly grow in coal, secondary carbonates from groundwater that form on fracture surfaces, as we saw previously in the Snelling example, and wheelite, a carbon-containing mineral that often forms as coal weathers. Minute amounts of contamination from any of these sources can cause apparent ages around the limit of radiocarbon dating, which is 50,000 years. Maddie from Science Side Up, friend of the channel, has also noted that Andrew Snelling's specific work on the subject of carbon-14 in coal is incredibly dubious for geologists.
Okay, so I think it was his rate research group that did this. This was in the video that I covered like a couple weeks ago, where he talked about finding carbon-14 in coal that was like several million years old. And so here he's still using, he's talking about carbon-14 measured in biological samples up to 540 million years old. And here is, look, we found carbon-14 in them. That's what he's saying with this plot. And this team, this is why I'm mad. Because I think he's lying or in being intentionally dishonest here. So it is possible to like reintroduce carbon-14 into like coal or a diamond or some sort of like dead sample. So by dead, I just mean not bringing in more carbon-14. That is possible, but what's much more damning here is the way that those carbon-14 ratios are measured. If you guys have wondered what I did with my weekend, it was reading papers on this. Okay, so how do y'all think that radiocarbon, carbon-14 is measured in these samples? You think it's a mass spec? You think they actually identify number of atoms? Because that's what I thought when I took the dear doctor here at his word. That is not how they measure it, team. That is not how they measure it. The way they measure it is by the radiation. So they measure the beta particles coming off, right? They measure how much beta radiation is being emitted by the sample. So you guys know why that means Dr. Snelling here is being dishonest? Because guess what else beta decays? Guess what else beta decays, team? Potassium. Potassium-40 beta decays, and it has a much longer half-life. Potassium-40 contributes to what's known as background radiation. So over the time span of these samples that we would look at, right, things that are up to 60,000 years old, right, it's the decay from the beta particles that you get, that background radiation, is constant from the potassium to argon decay, right? And so you can just subtract that out from the beta particles from the beta minus decay of the carbon-14 you're trying to measure, right? So when he says that they find this radiocarbon in fossils, and on the previous video of his that I did, when he said, oh, we found the same levels of carbon-14 in these two coal samples that were millions of years difference in age. Guys, he wasn't measuring radiocarbon, he was measuring potassium argon decay. And he has to, I have to believe he knows that, right? Like, he has to know that, right?
How'd you do your analysis, Snelling? Use an AMS? Why must you turn physics into a house of lies? You're right, I use beta decay. Beta decay. It should also be noted that that 2,000-year spread that Snelling was talking about is actually a spread of 8,000 years, 4 times Snelling's initial prediction. This, of course, means that the prediction utterly failed.
I didn't go to school for math.
This is, of course, patently unacceptable for a geologist as educated as Andrew Snelling, and is likely precisely the reason why no legitimate geologist has noted his work on radiocarbon. Radiocarbon, being found in dinosaur fossils, has been touted since the 1990s, but recently it's made a resurgence in young Earth creationist literature and media. The claim originated in 2 papers from 1990, one by Dahmer and one by Fields, which examined Mesozoic wood, ammonite shells, and dinosaur fossils. Of course, we have already discussed why 2 of these are effectively irrelevant to the young Earth creationist cause. Since the 1990s, though, other YEC names have weaponized the idea of carbon in dinosaur bones from Snelling to Austin. So how is it that measurable radiocarbon is indeed present in these fossils? The answer is that although the fossils have lost their original radiocarbon, they have since accumulated new radiocarbon, which yields a falsely young radiocarbon age. This should sound familiar, as it's quite similar to all of the other examples that we've discussed. After a dinosaur dies, the amount of C14 in the bone drops as the bone loses organic material during the microbial decay phase and the collagen gelatinization phase. However, the amount of C14 in bone then rises again as bone mineral gains new C14. There are 5 ways that old bone mineral gains new radiocarbon: recrystallization, permineralization, encrustation, bacterial contamination, and uranium decay. Recrystallization brings new radiocarbon into bone material when carbonate replaces phosphate in the crystal structure of the bone mineral. The new carbonate contains C14 because it comes from bicarbonate and carbonate in groundwater, which are derived from the dissolution of atmospheric CO2, which also contains C14. Permineralization and encrustation by calcite and other carbonates also bring new C14 into bone. The purification process called pretreatment can remove the carbonate in fillings and crusts, but it cannot remove the carbonate that has been incorporated into the crystal structure of bone mineral by recrystallization. Bacterial contamination occurs when old geologic samples accumulate new radiocarbon through the metabolic activity of recent bacteria and fungi, which take in atmospheric CO2. The presence of their cells and their organic wastes adds C14 to coal samples, and methane that they excrete can also add C14 to petroleum if the temperature is low enough to support live bacteria. Coal and petroleum also contain enough radiocarbon to yield falsely young dates of a few tens of thousands of years old. There is no reason to suppose that recent bacteria and fungi, if present on or in fossil bone, would not add C14 to it, yielding falsely young radiocarbon ages, as with other geological samples. And lastly, in uranium decay, new C14 is added to geological samples via the radioactive decay products of uranium. Radioactive emissions from uranium-238 add new C14 by converting certain other isotopes. In addition, some of the daughter isotopes of uranium-238 themselves emit C14 nuclei during radioactive decay. Buried bone readily take up uranium via groundwater and concentrates it so that fossil bone usually has a higher uranium content than the surrounding sediment. Furthermore, some young Earth creationists have tried to date dinosaur collagen, as collagen is typically reliable. The exception is if the collagen present is less than 1% of the weight of a full sample, i.e., a 50 milligram sample of bone will need at least 0.5 milligrams of collagen by weight. It turns out that the compiled percentage weight of all creationist dinosaur collagen samples is well below the minimum threshold needed for a reliable date.
Wow.
Why creationists do not ever seem to address these processes speaks either to their uninformed status of the literature or to their intentional omission of it. Lastly is the classic radiocarbon in diamonds claim that's been making the rounds recently. This one popped up originally on Answers in Genesis back in 2007, where they actually cited their sources. They linked a paper by R.E. Taylor and J. Southern titled Use of Natural Diamonds to Monitor Carbon-14 in AMS Instrument Backgrounds, which was published in the Nuclear Instruments and Methods in Physics Research Journal. The creationist interpretation of this paper essentially argues that since carbon-14 is being found in diamonds from the Paleozoic, then the diamonds, and thus the Earth, must be significantly younger than we thought. You will be shocked to know that this is a gross mischaracterization that borders on outright deceit. So, business as usual. The scientists were intentionally attempting to measure background radiation in AMS methodology. When a sample of carbon is dated, it is effectively vaporized in order to get a radiocarbon ratio, and some of that vaporized carbon ends up contaminating subsequent samples ever so slightly. A big part in the development of good scientific instruments and in analytical processes is to make sure that the background signal is 1, as low as possible, and 2, to make sure that the background signal is consistently qualified, using a blank so that you can calibrate for it. The researchers were using the diamonds as such blanks and thus intended to pick up on background radiation from the very start of the study. That was the point. And so Answers in Genesis took a routine study that was actually aimed at further calibrating radiocarbon dating, and they managed to warp it into something entirely different, something that the authors themselves are evidently very angry about. Of course, diamonds can additionally be contaminated by uranium veins and other methods of background radiation, which is why calibration is so important. This is also why single instances of these proposed discordant dates are not capable of overturning an ancient Earth. They are rarely repeatable with actual, accurate, proper methodology, and more importantly, they present no challenge to the biggest issue for Young Earth Creationism: dozens of independent dating methods that corroborate one another and show an ancient Earth. So, as we've seen, radiocarbon dating is almost always goofed up by Young Earth Creationists, whether it's the YouTube amateurs using it as a catch-all for any dating method, or professionals demonstrating an inability to properly sample, decontaminate, and calibrate for its usage. In reality, this method of dating younger organic materials is firmly grounded in the law of radioactive decay, and consistently yields accurate dates that are corroborated by independent dating methods such as dendrochronology and human historical records. These radiocarbon dates are obtained by using well-understood methods of sampling, decontamination, and calibration, which is precisely why modern radiocarbon dates align so precisely with tree ring data and human history and stalagmite growth and ice cores. This corroborative data set of all of these independent methods firmly obliterates Young Earth Creationism, both alone and when they're considered in tandem with one another. Which of course means that radiocarbon dating does indeed preclude Young Earth Creationism. Creationist responses to this bust will likely be surface level in their entirety. I'm imagining that we're probably going to see a lot of complaints about background radiation from the sun. They'll probably call it like ad hoc or a rescue device or something along those lines. But this betrays an utterly astonishing lack of understanding about how science is meant to work, as well as how radioactive elements interact with one another and how long we've known about things like background radiation from the sun. It isn't the fault of conventional scientists that Young Earth creationists are evidently just hearing about this, about contaminants like terrestrial groundwater or, again, background radiation from the sun. So if you encounter these types, I think it would be best to simply ask the Young Earth creationist in question why it is that these modern radiocarbon dates that we're pulling in today, every year, every month, sometimes every week, why it is that these dates match so many other completely independent methods of dating, and why these methods also all match one another, intercorroborating and independently showing that the Earth is much older than 6,000 years. And so join me next next time, my gentle and of course very modern apes, for another bite-sized bust to some big pseudoscience.